Hello everyone, this is Jeff with Mississippi in the Civil War, and I'm going to talk to you today about artillery as it was used during the Siege of Vicksburg. And I thought what better image to open the talk with than this picture of captured Confederate artillery down by the riverfront. This photo was taken after the siege ended, after the Federals had gathered up a lot of the Confederate ordnance that had been used during the siege. And it just gives you an idea of just how much artillery was used during the Siege of Vicksburg. There were hundreds of guns on each side. It was one of the great artillery battles of the war. And today I'm just going to talk to you about how these guns were used during the siege, and also just go over some of the more commonly used and some of the more interesting models of artillery that would have been employed during the Siege of Vicksburg. I'm not going to touch on them all. I'm sure I will miss some, but I am going to try and cover all of the most commonly used types of artillery, and again, just some of the more interesting types of artillery. And I come by my love of Civil War ordnance justly. For many years, I was a Civil War reenactor, and the unit I served in was Turner's Battery, Company C, 1st Mississippi Light Artillery. I joined the unit when I was a student at Mississippi State University and stayed with it for the better part of a decade. And this is a photo taken of our unit at Okolona, Mississippi in the early 1990s. And while I was a member of Turner's Battery, I was fortunate enough to get to actually work on a number of original cannon. I was able to fire cannon not only in reenactments with blanks, but also we did a lot of live shoots and competition shoots. And it really gave me an appreciation for just how technical, how skilled you had to be to man a Civil War artillery piece, and just how deadly accurate these guns could be in the hands of well-trained cannoneers who knew how to service and fire these weapons. And during the Siege of Vicksburg, General John C. Pemberton, the Confederate commander, had for the defense of the city of Vicksburg 172 cannon. Of those 172, 103 were field pieces or light artillery, and there were about 69 heavy guns. Of this number, 37 of the heavy guns, along with 13 of the field pieces, were in the river defenses, protecting the waterfront that ran, the Mississippi River that ran past the city of Vicksburg. The rest of these cannons, the majority of them, were in the landward defenses that were spread throughout the 8 miles of siege lines, and it averaged about one gun every 250 yards as you went through that entire 8 miles of siege line. And the rebel artillery that were emplaced in the landward defenses had two main missions during the siege. The first was to provide defensive firepower to try and break up and stop an enemy assault. And this they did very well. During the May 19th and the May 22nd assaults on the Vicksburg fortifications, the Confederate artillery caused a lot of casualties, and in both cases the attacks were stopped cold with a combination of artillery and infantry fire that just suppressed the Federals so much they were unable to complete a successful assault on the fortifications. Now, the second mission of the Confederate artillery was to suppress the Union soldiers who were digging approach trenches towards the Confederate works during the siege. Now, in this role, they were generally not very effective. The guns in the Vicksburg defenses were so dispersed that they were unable to achieve artillery domination of any particular area of the siege lines. Also, the Southern cannoneers were hampered by orders from General Pemberton to conserve their ammunition. They were hampered by a shortage of ammunition and a shortage of friction primers to fire the cannons, so they had to husband what they had, and they could only fire very judiciously. And this allowed the Federal artillery to really dominate the battlefield. And it put the Southern cannoneers at a very distinct disadvantage compared to their Northern counterparts, because the Federals, who had no shortage of ammunition during the siege, were able to keep up a very heavy artillery fire throughout the entire 47-day siege, which really helped to suppress the Confederates and make the Union digging efforts to try and dig their approach trenches much easier, because they were not receiving a lot of return fire. And this is a photo I took a few years ago of an artillery crew out in the Vicksburg National Military Park using a 12-pounder Napoleon. And this was taken out, in fact, you can see in the background the 3rd Louisiana, or the Louisiana Monument near the Great Redoubt in the background. Now, to give you an idea of just how much artillery was used during the Siege of Vicksburg, in August 1863, the New York Times published a synopsis of the Union expenditure of artillery rounds during the siege. Lieutenant Colonel William L. Duff, who was General Ulysses S. Grant's chief of artillery, gave the following numbers. He stated that during the 47-day siege, the Union artillery fired 9,598 rounds during the May 19th assault. They fired 10,754 rounds during the May 22nd assault, and they fired 111,614 rounds during the remainder of the siege. And this averaged out to 653 rounds fired by each Union cannon during the siege. That is a lot of metal being thrown into the Confederate lines, and it really helped the Federals to achieve a massive artillery domination of the battlefield. And this is a great period image. You can see an artillery piece firing over here on the left side of the image. And it's titled "The Siege of Vicksburg, the Fight in the Crater at Fort Hill After the Explosion, June 27, 1863. This is from Frank Leslie's Illustrated magazine. Just a great image. And to be on the receiving end of that much artillery was really mind-numbing. And to give you an idea, Sergeant William Tunnard of the 3rd Louisiana Infantry wrote in his memoir that on June 20th, 1863, quote, "At early dawn, every gun along the line suddenly opened, keeping up a rapid and continuous fire. All concurred in the opinion that such a tremendous cannonading had never been equaled in their experience, and the volume of sound surpassed anything yet heard. It seemed as if heaven and earth trembled under the heavy concussion." And this is another great period illustration showing Federal artillery in the siege lines. And the illustration is entitled "Waterhouse's Battery, Sherman's Corps before Vicksburg. The interior view of Waterhouse's Battery in Tuttle's division, showing the guns in position and the huts in which the men are crowded." Just another, again, great image taken, drawn at the time of the siege. And the Union artillery at Vicksburg had approximately 220 cannon, organized into 89 separate batteries. And they had 3 main objectives during the siege of Vicksburg. The first was to keep the enemy Confederate artillery suppressed. The second was to smash openings in the enemy earthworks. And the third was to provide fire support for the men digging the approach trenches. And the Union artillery accomplished all 3 of these missions and did them very well. They concentrated their cannon into large groups so that they could dominate areas of the battlefield, and they were able to very quickly smash any Confederate artillery that tried to fire against them just by having such large concentrations of guns. For every Confederate gun that fired, you might have 5, 6, 7 Union guns firing back. So the Confederates had to be very careful when they employed their artillery, because they were usually going to be met by a withering return fire whenever they shot. And this illustration is a good example. This particular illustration from Frank Leslie's is entitled "Siege of Vicksburg, Cannon Dismounted Inside the Confederate Works." And that's just the kind of thing that the Confederates had to worry about when they fired a gun, was all the receiving artillery they were going to be receiving back. And now let's talk about some of the artillery models commonly used at Vicksburg and some of the interesting types of artillery used at Vicksburg. And one of the older guns that was in use at the Siege of Vicksburg was the Model 1841 6-pounder gun. And this model had been adopted by the United States in 1841 and had been used to very good effect during the Mexican War. By the time of the Civil War, however, it was nearing the end of its useful life. It had been surpassed by newer and more powerful models, but the outbreak of war really gave this old warhorse a new lease on life. There were lots of them in southern arsenals and in northern arsenals for that matter, and until better models could be produced in large numbers, these 6-pounders would soldier on, particularly in the Western theater, which tended to be the dumping ground for a lot of the older equipment, where the armies in the East tended to get a lot of the newer equipment first. But the Confederates at Vicksburg surrendered 46-pounder cannon when the Siege of Vicksburg ended. And this gun fired a smoothbore round, a round ball, and this is an example. This is an original 6-pounder round, and you see it's still connected to its original wooden sabot. And this artillery shell, you had the iron shell itself. It was connected to a wooden block called a sabot, and then connected to the sabot would have been a powder bag with black powder. So it was a fixed cartridge, and it always ran down the muzzle of the cannon at one time. And then our next gun, and a personal favorite of mine, the Model 1857 12-pounder gun howitzer. And this model was invented in France and named for French Emperor Napoleon III. The Model 1857 was, of course, adopted by the United States in 1857, and it was one of the most popular smoothbore guns used during the Civil War. The Napoleon was a very versatile cannon. It could fire solid shot, explosive shell, explosive case shot, and it could also fire canister. Both the Union and the Confederacy manufactured these cannon during the war, and they can usually be distinguished by looking at the muzzle. The Union-made guns swell at the muzzle, and the Confederate-made guns have a straight barrel with no muzzle swell. And they fired a smoothbore round that looked like this. And it's a round ball. You can see it has a Borman time fuse, so this was a shell or a case shot. See the numbers on the face of the fuse. You had a punch that you would punch it out at the number of seconds you needed for the flight time of the shell, so that it would explode near your target. Very sophisticated shell for its day, and the Borman was widely used by the Federals. Confederates also manufactured a copy of the Borman fuse. It was not nearly as reliable, and they had a lot of trouble with them, which was common for Confederate manufacturing. And this is a picture I took several years ago of a 12-pounder Napoleon actually out on the Vicksburg battlefield. And you can see the Illinois monument in the distance. I love these guns. Those beautiful guns just shine. And one neat thing about a Napoleon, when you fire it live, every time you fire it, the tube just rings like a bell. It's a beautiful sound if you're an artilleryman. I just love it. And then another very commonly used artillery piece during the Siege of Vicksburg was the 10-pounder Parrott rifle. And this gun was invented by Robert P. Parrott, the superintendent of West Point Foundry in Cold Spring, New York. And this gun was very widely produced by the Union. They were also liked by the Confederacy as well, and they copied them themselves. The Parrott can be very quickly recognized by this very distinctive reinforcing band it has at the breech of the gun. And this band provided additional strength to help the cannon survive the shock of firing. The manufacturing processes being what they were during the Civil War, they still had a lot of problems with making iron guns and making them strong enough to withstand the shock of firing. And so this reinforcing band was just a method of making sure they had enough metal back there at the breech of the gun to help contain that powerful explosion when the round was set off. But the Parrott was a very widely used weapon, a very accurate weapon, as I can attest, as I have fired 10-pounder Parrotts quite a lot in live shoots, and it was a very accurate weapon. And this is the round that it fired. 10-pound. That's a 10-pound shell, and very accurate round, and very useful round. They fired a lot of those during the siege of Vicksburg. And then its older brother was the 20-pounder Parrott. And like its smaller brother, the 10-pounder, the 20-pounder Parrott rifle, model of 1861, was designed by Robert Parker Parrott. He was the U.S. Army ordnance officer who inspected cannons at the West Point Foundry in Cold Spring, New York. And it was adopted by the Army in 1861, and this gun fired a 20-pound projectile to a maximum range of about 1,900 yards. The Confederates also copied this design, and they did surrender one 20-pound Parrott when the siege of Vicksburg ended. These guns would have been on the large side for field artillery. It was a heavy gun. It was not easy to move, but very effective once you got it into position, because it was firing a large shell, and it was very well liked by the crews for its accuracy and its reliability. And this is the shell that the 20-pounder fired. Again, looks very almost identical to the 10-pounder Parrott, the only difference being it's twice the size. And then another personal favorite of mine, which I've also had a lot of experience with, the 3-inch ordnance rifle. And this cannon was invented by John Griffin in 1855. And the 3-inch ordnance rifle was one of the most popular, accurate, and reliable cannon produced by the Union Army during the Civil War. These guns were constructed using a wrought iron forging and welding process that produced a very strong weapon that easily withstood the stresses of firing black powder. And the Union built over 1,000 of these guns during the war. The South never had the manufacturing capability to make these guns. They were simply too technologically advanced, but they did use every one that they could capture, and they captured quite a few. But these guns were widely employed by the Federals during the siege of Vicksburg. And this is the shell that it fired, a 3-inch Hotchkiss round. And this is an explosive shell. In fact, you can see in the shell the flame groove in the side of the shell that helped the powder charge when it was fired, helped the flame to get to the paper time fuse in the nose. And then another very interesting rifle used during the siege of Vicksburg was the 12-pounder James rifle. Invented by Charles T. James, he developed a rifled projectile and a rifling system. And early in the war, many older 6-pounder smoothbores that were in service with the Union Army were rifled and turned into 12-pounder rifles. It was a way to take an older weapon, a 6-pounder smoothbore, and try and update it, make it more accurate, give it a longer range. And these guns were classified as rifled 6-pounder guns, or alternatively as 12-pounder James rifles, because if you take a 6-pounder smoothbore and rifle it, then you can use a 12-pound projectile in it, basically doubling the size of the projectile you can throw. And by the time of the siege of Vicksburg, the James guns were falling out of favor simply because the rifling in these bronze tubes did not last very long. After repeated firing, the metal is very soft, so after repeated firing, the gun starts to become inaccurate because the rifling is just wearing out. And this is the type of projectile one of these guns would have fired, a James shell. And very distinctive looking, very beautiful looking shell, if I do say so. But it's a very distinctive round, so you can always tell a James when you see it. The Confederates at Vicksburg surrendered one 12-pound James rifle when the siege ended, but they also had a number of larger smoothbore cannon that had been rifled using the James system to take these older smoothbores and turn them into more modern rifled cannon. And this is a close-up of a 14-pounder James that was at the Vicksburg National Military Park, just giving you a good view of the rifling inside the muzzle. And again, this rifling just unfortunately tended to wear down very quickly, so these guns didn't have a very long service life. And then one of the more interesting guns that was used during the siege of Vicksburg, there weren't a lot of them, but they're very interesting, was the 12-pounder Whitworth. And the 12-pounder Whitworth was invented in the early 1850s by British manufacturer Joseph Whitworth. And these were probably among the most accurate field artillery pieces produced and used during the Civil War. One of these guns was surrendered at the end of the siege of Vicksburg. There was another that had been used during the siege, but it got knocked out. And these were very accurate weapons. But they used a very unusual hexagonal bolt. The only thing was, while they were very accurate, the bursting charge that you could put inside one of these shells, because it was so long and narrow, was relatively small, so it didn't have a very effective bursting charge inside of it. So most of the time, the Confederates were using the just solid bolts with them, non-explosive rounds. So it kind of limited the effectiveness of these guns. But if you were sniping at something, a Whitworth was the way to go. And also they could be loaded and fired very quickly because this is a breech-loading cannon, one of the very few in use during the Civil War. In fact, probably the most widely known of the breech loaders that was used during the Civil War. And then another weapon used by the Confederates in particular during the siege was the model 1841 24-pounder howitzer. And this was a bronze smoothbore muzzle-loading artillery piece that had been adopted by the United States Army in 1841. It had been used to great effect during the Mexican War, and then it was also used particularly in the early years of the Civil War. It fired an 18.4-pound shell. It had a maximum range of about 1,322 yards at 5 degrees of elevation, and it could fire canister shot, spherical case shot, and it was just a very versatile weapon, and they were very well liked, even though it was a somewhat antiquated weapon by the time of the Civil War. But the Confederates had a number of them in their arsenals at the beginning of the war. They also imported a number of them during the war from Austria. So a number of these were used during the siege. In fact, the Confederates surrendered 7 bronze and 2 iron 24-pounders when the siege of Vicksburg ended. So these were pretty widely used in the siege lines by the Confederates. And this is the smoothbore round that the 24-pounder fired. In fact, you can still see the remains of the iron bands that would have held on the wooden sabot at the back end of the round that the powder bag was attached to. And then another gun that was widely used at Vicksburg, particularly there were a lot of these in the river defenses. This is the 32-pounder cannon. And these were in service for decades before the Civil War in many different models. And the 32-pounder was very widely used by the Confederates, as I said, in the river batteries. And although designed to be a smoothbore, by the time of the Civil War, many of these guns were being rifled to make them more effective. They could increase the size of the round and make them more accurate at the same time. So in the Confederate works, they had both types. They had both the original smoothbore guns firing a round ball, like so, and then they had also some of the guns rifled and firing a rifled projectile. And this photo in the picture was taken after the siege, and this is a 32 pounder that was reused by the Federals after the siege in one of their defensive works at Vicksburg called the Castle Battery. And then the big brother to the 32 pounder is the 42 pounder. And this is a photo, a modern photo I took at Battery Benton at Vicksburg. And this is an original 42 pounder. And this gun was used by the Confederates in the river batteries, both in its original smoothbore configuration, firing around like this, and in its rifled iteration that fired a projectile like this. And the Union Army also had two 42 pounder guns that it borrowed from the USS Benton, which is one of the city-class ironclads that was in action during the siege of Vicksburg. And the Federals managed to get these off of the ironclad and put them into an earthwork position in the siege lines, firing into the Confederates. And from all the accounts, they gave very good service. And this is a 9-inch Dahlgren cannon. And the Dahlgren guns were designed by Rear Admiral John A. Dahlgren of the United States Navy, and mostly used during and around the period of the American Civil War. And Dahlgren had, as an officer in the 1840s, witnessed an explosion of a Navy cannon that killed or wounded a number of sailors, and it gave him the idea to produce a more a safer gun that was much stronger, that would not blow up when you fired it. And the design he came up with, this bottle shape, was a very strong gun, and was exactly what he had intended. A gun that would withstand the shock of firing these large black powder loads, and do so and fire a very accurate round. And because of their shape, the Dahlgren guns were nicknamed as soda bottles, a shape which became their most identifiable characteristic. And the 9-inch Dahlgren was a very popular and versatile weapon, and the tube alone weighed about 9,000 pounds, and it fired a 90-pound solid shot or a 75-pound shell. And the Confederates had managed to acquire a 9-inch Dahlgren, and actually used it during the siege and the river defenses in Battery Number 5, located on what is today Fort Hill Drive. And fire from this gun, among others, helped to sink the USS Cincinnati. When this is the shell that it fired, and then this is the USS Cincinnati that was sunk by Confederate artillery fire on May 27, 1863. Interestingly enough, the Federals, after the siege, were able to refloat the Cincinnati and put it back into service. And this is one of the Confederate river batteries that was in use during the siege of Vicksburg. This is the Marine Hospital Battery, and this photo was taken after the siege. It was located in the southern part of the city, and this battery was one of the most powerful in the Confederate defenses. It mounted 3 42-pounder smoothbore cannon, 2 32-pounder smoothbore cannon, and 2 32-pounder rifled cannon. And it was named after the Marine Hospital, which was located to its rear, which was a pre-war United States government facility that was meant to be a hospital for crews working on the Mississippi River. And it was used by the Confederates as a hospital during the siege. And unfortunately, a lot of federal fire that was being directed at the Marine Hospital Battery overshot and managed to hit the Marine Hospital. Here's another personal favorite of mine, the 30-pounder Parrott rifle. And this is another gun that I have been fortunate enough to fire live, and it was quite an experience. This is a large weapon, but there were a number of them in use during the siege of Vicksburg. Parrott rifles came in a number of sizes. In addition to the 10, the 20, and the 30, they also had much larger 100 and 200 pound Parrotts. Unfortunately, with the larger Parrotts, as you got up into some of the really big ones, they had an unfortunate tendency to burst after firing too many rounds. That the iron that they were made out of was rather soft, and even with the reinforcing band, some of the bigger ones did have a well-deserved reputation for bursting, which didn't make them any too fond with the crews that had to serve them. But the smaller guns, the 10, the 20, and the 30, tended to be very reliable weapons and didn't have the problems that some of the larger Parrotts had. But this was a photo, and you can see there some of the shells for this gun. That's a 30-pound shell that this gun fired. This tube alone weighs 8,000 pounds. It is a big gun, but it was a very accurate gun, and they were well employed by the Union and Confederate soldiers that used them at Vicksburg. Now, without a doubt, the most famous named gun that served at Vicksburg during the siege was an 18-pounder rifled cannon known as Whistling Dick. And unfortunately, there are no photographs of Whistling Dick, but I was able to find this photograph taken at the Alamo of an 18-pounder. And Whistling Dick would have looked similar, at least the tube. The cannon trail would have been different, but it would have looked somewhat similar to this. But it got its name from the unusual sound that the shell made when it was fired. It whistled and made a very distinctive sound as it flew across the battlefield. Whistling Dick was originally located in the railroad battery protecting the Vicksburg riverfront. The gun was disabled by gunboat fire on May 22nd, but it was repaired and then put back into service. It was then moved into the landward defenses in rear of Brigadier General Stephen D. Lee's brigade on May 28th. Whistling Dick disappeared when the siege of Vicksburg ended. It's one of the great mysteries of the siege. No one is certain of what happened to it. There are stories that the Confederates dumped it in the Mississippi River to keep it from falling into federal hands. But as of 2022, no one is really certain of the fate of Whistling Dick. I have great hopes that one day this gun is going to turn up, but for now, it remains one of the great lost named cannon of the Civil War. And this is the type of round that it fired, an 18-pound rifled projectile. The 18-pounder was an old, obsolete gun, and again, it was rifled by the Confederates in an effort to update it, make it more accurate, and increase its range. And this is another interesting gun. This is a double-banded Brook rifle, and there were a number of them, or several of them, used in the river batteries. There was a 6.4-inch gun in the appropriately named Brook Battery, located in the southern part of the city in the river defenses, and a 7-inch double-banded Brook in Battery 5 in the northern part of the river defenses. And this is a photo taken at Vicksburg of one of those Brook rifles, and I'm not certain which one it is, if it's the 6.4-inch or the 7-inch, but it's one of them. But the Brook rifle was invented by Confederate naval officer John M. Brooke, and they were produced in two locations, at Tredegar Iron Works in Richmond, Virginia, and the Confederate Naval Ordnance Works in Selma, Alabama. And fire from the 7-inch Brook, manned by cannoneers of the 1st Tennessee Heavy Artillery, played an important role in helping to sink the USS Cincinnati during the siege. And this is the type of round that the Brook rifles fired. In fact, you can see several of them again sitting here in the foreground of the picture. And this is another famous named gun of the Siege of Vicksburg. This is a 7.44-inch Blakely rifle. And this gun was located in the Marine Hospital Battery. And the guns were in place so as to provide a plunging fire against the Union ironclads and penetrate their unarmored roofs. The Blakely rifle was known as the Widow Blakely because it was the only one of its type in the Vicksburg defenses. On May 22nd, one of the Widow Blakely's own shells exploded in the muzzle while firing on a Union ironclad, and the muzzle of the gun had to be cut back, and then the Confederates put it back into service during the siege. And this gun is still in Vicksburg, and today it is located on Louisiana Circle in Vicksburg along Washington Street. And this is the shell that the Blakely fired. And then one of the most massive guns used during the siege of Vicksburg was the 10-inch Columbiad. This was an old design. The Columbiad had first been adopted by the United States in 1811, and it's one of the main weapons used to defend the young nation's seacoast. These very large guns had a smoothbore tube. The tube alone was massive. This gun weighed 15,400 pounds. And the Confederates used a number of them in the Vicksburg defenses. And this is the ball that one of these Columbiads would have fired. It was a big boy. And it was a very effective weapon at close range against shipping. So that's why they had a lot of them in the river defenses. And in fact, you could see a number of these guns today. This is in the water battery at Vicksburg National Military Park. And these are down by the National Cemetery. In fact, you can see the cemetery in the background. And then another personal favorite of mine, just because it's such a beast of a gun, the 13-inch Seacoast mortar, or the 13-inch siege mortar. The 13-inch mortar was a massive gun. It weighed approximately 17,000 pounds, and it was capable of firing a 200-pound shell like this over 2.5 miles. The Union Navy had 6 of these guns mounted on rafts in the Mississippi River firing into Vicksburg during the siege, and they fired a lot. They fired over 7,000 rounds into Vicksburg during the siege. So these were very commonly used. At the distances that they were firing, they were not very accurate, but they were just a harassment weapon that they could easily target the city, and they did. And they were quite effective at their job of causing as much trouble for the Confederates in the city as possible. Just a massive gun. And then the last gun I'm going to talk about today is probably the most unusual, and it's the sweet gum mortar. And during the Civil War, wooden mortars were used in a number of battles, but the very first one that they were used in was the Siege of Vicksburg. The Federals, as they got close to the Confederate lines, needed something that could, they needed mortars that could fire up and over the Confederate fortifications and hit the Confederates that were protected by the earthworks. And they didn't have any mortars with them, so the next best thing, they made mortars. They were able to make out of sweet gum, which is a very strong wood, a number of these wooden mortars. They bored them out, put a couple of iron reinforcing bands on them, and they were light. They weighed about 124 pounds. They could fire either a 6 or a 12-pound shell, which the Federals had in great numbers, and so their ammunition was no problem. And at about 100 yards range, you could drop one of these with ease into the Confederate works, and they used a number of them, and they were quite effective during the siege, according to the Union and the Confederate accounts. So it's just a really neat weapon. And there are a number of these surviving. I think there are 3 known to survive. There are 2 in the collections of the Missouri, I believe it's Missouri Museum, Missouri Historical Museum, and I think there's one up in Minnesota. In fact, I think it's on display in the Minnesota State House. But these are just a really neat solution to a problem that they had on the battlefield. Soldiers can be very inventive when they need to be, and this is a good example. Just a great field improvisation to get around a problem that the Union soldiers had. But this ends my talk on artillery during the Siege of Vicksburg. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them for me. I'd love to hear them. And thank you so much for tuning in. Please, if you haven't done so already, subscribe to my channel if you like my content, and also give this video a like. It's really my only way of gauging what kind of viewership I'm getting and how many of these videos I should try and put out. But again, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you again soon.